The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the honourable member for Paramatta.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak on this Copyright Amendment Online Infringement Bill 2018, which is actually quite a small but sensible change to our copyright law, which seeks to protect rights holders in a time of incredible transition. And I wasn't originally going to speak on this today, but I heard my colleague, the member for Chifley, speaking earlier, and I just felt the need to add a little bit of nuance to the debate. I was actually working for the Association of Independent Record Labels, which was the trade association for small record labels. We represented about 95% of the independent sector during the time of Napster. And we knew Napster was coming because some 7 years earlier than that, a young man called Jeff Patterson, who was about 19, started a business called the Internet Underground Music Archive in the University of Santa Cruz in California. That was 1992. It was a music download site that was so popular that it crashed the servers at the universities, and they had to ban music downloads for quite a few years while they caught up with it. And then Napster, of course, came later. It was there from 1999 to 2001. But what I want to say is that these changes are not just about the consumer and the rights holder. In fact, in many ways, they're not about that at all. If Napster had have charged the consumer and the artists had have been paid for all those transactions, it was the distributor that was actually going to be the loser. The major earner in the music industry back then was actually the people in the middle, the distributors. As the music industry went towards economies of scale, where you made more and more money the more you produced, large distributors moved into the middle that were capable of shifting large amounts of products, and they took 60% of retail. They were actually the big earner. And they also happened to be also the big record companies. All the major record companies have major distribution arms, and it was the distribution side of it that was actually under threat by online trading. Even if the artist was paid, the distributor was the one that would lose. And in some ways, we're in a similar situation now, because we have seen a move in the music industry and all the copyright owners' industries, all the IP industries for that matter, from economies of scope to economies of scale. Now, from economies of scale backwards to economies of scope. Economies of scale, of course, is where you reduce your costs of production by creating many more. So if you make 100,000, your cost of production goes down than if you make one. Economies of scale, we all know what that is, and in the industrial age, economies of scale was the source of competitive advantage. The bigger you are, the cheaper you make your unit cost of production, the more you make. But we're moving now, particularly with IP, into a world where economies of scope is the determinant of competitive advantage, and it's quite different. The old theory of economies of scope, when we were giving lectures about it in the arts industry some 30 years ago, was that if you made 2 or more goods, for less, you could do that for lesser product than make 2 separate goods. That's called economies of scope, and you see it in advanced manufacturing. But in the arts industry, always knew that it wasn't about the goods that were made, it was about the selling of it. Because in the arts industry, we hadn't been industrialised. So we didn't just create a product, which is a piece of art, we actually created a relationship with our consumer. We call it our fan base. And what we needed to do, because we put on concerts where you put on one night and thousands of people that had to turn up, is we built relationships with our market. And our market relationship was as valuable as anything. In fact, it was the thing that helped us survive. Economies of scope, we knew, would be when you could sell 2 or more products to the same market rather than have to develop different markets for each product. So economies of scope, we knew 30 years ago, would make our market the product as the world moved out of the industrial age into what we then call the information age. We knew that the market, the people who bought your product and your relationship with them, was going to be the source of your competitive advantage. Now, what we have now in the online world is a whole range of new organisations slipping into that middle between the consumer and the artist, and actually starting to own the relationship. Right? They're moving into that middle space because they know the Amazons, all of those, even in restaurants, the Deliveroos, all of those, they all know that if they can collect the appropriate relationship and the data about that relationship, they can sell more products to that market, to that one market, than by providing different markets for each product. It's economies of scope. It's a major change in where the economic advantage is, and we can see it happening every day. It's not going to stop. It's actually a really interesting change. It's on its way. It's going to stop. But as we transition from the old model, where the artist actually owned their relationship with their market, to a world where someone else inserts themselves in the middle and owns the market, we're actually losing a significant part of the assets of the artist. So we have a very difficult transition if an artist cannot actually own the information and the data on its own market, because we have someone else inserting themselves in the middle. Really interesting, and we're already hearing stories out of countries where Amazon, for example, is much more powerful, of the increasing inability of artists to launch their new product because they no longer have their fan base. And I want to tell you how important that is. When I was working for the Lyric Opera of Queensland back in the mid-80s, internet was kind of not there. We had a database then that I built where we actually knew the names and addresses of everybody who had bought a ticket to an opera company for the last 10 years, and when they bought it relative to our marketing spend. We knew if we mailed them, how long it took them to buy. We actually knew exactly. We knew if we put up a television advertising, these people were most likely to buy, so we didn't do direct mail to them because we knew they were... We actually had worked out when they bought relative to what we spent over about 10 years. And that was in the mid-80s, because we knew that our capacity to reach our market actually made us viable, and our capacity to reach our market was our source of competitive advantage. So I would just say, to my colleague, the member for Chifley, this is a much more nuanced argument. This isn't just an argument about the copyright as we know it now. It's an argument about the value of the data, who owns it, how it's created, how it's managed. The whole structure of the viability of artists is now changing. Some of the change will be for the good, some of it won't. Even back in the days, when the internet was very early, we bought out Jeff Patterson. I bought him out. I ran a national conference on music and the internet in the early 90s, and we bought two people: Jeff Patterson, who'd started the Internet Underground Music Archive, he looked like a child. He was kind of 19 years old, and he'd created this thing that crashed the entire US internet. And we bought out Bill Kreutzmann, who was the drummer for the Grateful Dead. And I did that for a really simple reason, that Grateful Dead allowed you to copyright it to steal anything. You could take a video camera into their concert and videotape it and sell it. You could bootleg, you could take in a recording and record it and sell it online. You could bootleg, you could do whatever you want. And for them, they were the biggest grossing live band in the world, because they actually used online as a way of promoting their next gig. But what they were doing was using the online pirate network to build their fan base, which they then were able to own. So they actually used it in a different way. We had another young man whose name I can't recall at that time, who'd been seriously pirated in Japan and a few countries he'd been to before that. But for him, it actually kind of worked in his favour, because it actually built his fan base. That's not the case for most. We need to protect the copyrights of artists, because for every exception to the rule, there are many, many others that need that serious protection, and this legislation is part of that. I just want to raise in this House that this is a much more nuanced issue than we think. And when the economic model does fully change and we have a completely different world where economies of scale is not it, where economies of scope and your relationship with your market and your ability to know and reach that market is the entire source of competitive advantage, we want our creative industry to still be there. We don't want it to be knocked out on the way because we failed to adjust our laws to provide them protection through the transition. We're going to have, at some point in the future, and it won't be far away, a very serious discussion about the nature of copyright and the nature of protection and the nature of things of value. What is of value in a post-industrial world? what is of value. We're going to have a very serious conversation about it. But for the moment, this amendment, which seeks to protect the rights of copyright owners now as this transition continues, is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, we still want them to be there when the transition is complete. Thank you.